So today we're going to take a look at first the laws of logic, which sounds super boring and dry and kind of philosophy that doesn't apply to us in life, but I promise it hopefully will not be. And we'll use those to address postmodernism, or specifically just the idea that truth is relative, or the idea that we can't know truth. So we'll use that to address postmodernism, and then after that address pluralism, the idea that basically all roads lead to the same God. Both of those ideas, postmodernism and pluralism, are super prevalent in our culture today. I would say specifically, if anybody knows a handful of people in my generation, you probably know people that subscribe to both of those. Whether or not they've voiced it or you're aware of it. So the laws of logic will also help us out in several other classes as we kind of really formally spell these out and do them really clearly. It will then make it easier to very clearly and formally address issues in other people's worldviews or address ideas that are contrary to Christianity, which is what we're going to do in the second half of the class. So, what is truth? Can truth be known at all? Can truth about God be known? We'll tackle that. And then, don't all religions achieve the same purpose and lead to the same God? Kind of the four different things we'll go over. So, what is truth? It was kind of famously asked in the Bible by Pontius Pilate. In John 18:37-38, it says, "Then Pilate said to him, Jesus, so you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" We're not given the luxury of knowing how Jesus would have responded to that, although I feel like it could have been helpful to us in this class specifically. But I guess I'll pose that question to you guys. Well, how would you guys define, if the modern day Pontius Pilate or a college student you happen to know poses that question to you, what is truth? How would you answer that? Whether from a Christianese type of way or a non-Christianese type of way, however you want to phrase it.
It is what it is.
Truth is what it is. Oh, James.
There's different types of truth. There's like scientific types of truth. Something might be scientifically true, but not religiously true.
Okay. So you'd say there might be different categories of, what do you mean by truth? Okay.
Truth is what fits reality. So, yeah, what fits reality.
Yeah, what lines up with what is real. Yeah.
Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So Jesus is truth.
Yeah. Jesus is the truth. That sounds a little weird to a non-believer what that means, but yeah. Any other postulations, thoughts? So yeah, I would say those are some good definitions. So I mean, it's an accurate representation of reality. It is what is. It's in accordance with fact. The formal, dry definition of truth we're going to take from the three laws of logic, which are spelled out by Aristotle. I'll read off his definition of truth here, which is a little confusing, but we'll exegete it like good Christians know how to do. He says, "To say of what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false. While to say what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. So that he who says of anything that it is or that it is not will either say what is true or false." That was a lot of is's and truths and falses, but if you go through that really slowly, you'll kind of take out three different principles that we all inherently understand ourselves and we use in everyday conversation. I think whether or not we realize it. And those three different laws are, the first one being the law of, it's called the law of identity. So the law of identity basically says something is what it is, or if we put this in math terms, I just learned that was a math major in college. So A equals A, that's the law of identity. Something A is A, as obvious as that may seem. An example of that is a sentence just saying an apple is an apple, or a contradiction to that. And an example of violation would be an apple is not an apple. That sentence doesn't make sense. That sentence doesn't fit with the law of identity. If you say a table is not a table, because in that same sentence you're saying that it is and it isn't, that doesn't make sense. So the second law, kind of halfway through Aristotle's definition, is what we usually think of when we think of what is reasonable, what is logical, the law of non-contradiction. And basically that one says A does not equal non-A. Once again, super obvious, but hopefully spelling these out very obviously and formally will help us later. So an example of that is an apple is not a dog. So that adheres to the law of non-contradiction. An apple is not a dog, and you're rightfully stating that. A violation is saying an apple is a dog, because when I say the word apple, I mean something different than when I say the word dog.
And I'm struggling how that's different than law of identity.
It's kind of, yeah. I mean, you're rightly identifying that. It's kind of the same thing, spelled out a little bit differently. So usually, anytime you have a violation of the law of identity, you basically just call it a contradiction. So I don't disagree. Yeah. The third one is the law of the excluded middle. And this one, although I feel like we do inherently all use and know, may seem a little more controversial and comes into play when we're talking about truth being relative and whatnot. This one says that each truth claim is either true or false, that there is no middle ground. And a lot of people will take exception to that. I would say that statement, each truth claim is either true or false, there is no middle, is true as long as basically all of your terms have to be fully defined. The statement, an apple is a dog, seems like a contradiction, but you might say an apple is a dog in the sense that it smells good or something. So that statement can be true in a certain sense. Although dogs typically don't smell good, so maybe just like that they bring joy or something.
If the apple has been carved into the shape of a dog, you could say that apple is a dog.
Yes, exactly.
That would be very true.
Yeah, so in a certain sense, that statement could be true. So the law of excluded middle basically says that as long as your terms are fully defined, that you define what time, what place, in what sense you mean the word, every statement is either true or false. There's no in between. So a lot of times we find ourselves saying things like that's kind of true or partially true, and what we mean by that is it's only true in certain times, or it's only true in certain places, or it's only true in a certain sense. So as long as we define all those things, we take out the middle ground. So an example is an apple is either the same thing as a dog, or it is not. Another good example of the law of excluded middle is I can say it is raining. And the only way another statement, it is not raining, can be true is if in the second statement I'm referring to another place or another time, or if I'm using the word raining in a different definition the second time I use it. Where I can say the first time I meant it is raining rain, and then the second time it is not raining cats and dogs. So the law of excluded middle. And so this is the one that kind of controversially states that basically all truth is inherently absolute. And a lot of people would argue that, and that's what we're going to address next with Post-Modernism. So something I want to point out about these three laws of logic that Aristotle spelled out. The existence of truth and logical laws are proving. So in order to disprove them, you have to use them to try to disprove them, thus proving that they're true. It's impossible to avoid these. So the term for that is that they're axiomatic. A lot of people use that term in reference to the Bible. You might hear somebody say that the Bible is axiomatic. It proves itself. They might say that in reference to the fact that Old Testament prophecies coming true in the New Testament, the Bible just contained within itself proves its divine inspiration based off of that. So you don't have to go outside of it to prove that it's true. Similarly with these prove themselves. It's impossible to deny them. You don't need something else to prove them. As soon as you try to disprove them, you use them, and then you inherently prove that they're true. Does that make sense to you guys? Do you understand the self-proving concept, or does anybody take issue with any of these three laws? Because a lot of people do. So, no, not bad if at least if one of them doesn't make sense. Or anything like that. Okay. So the first thing we're going to use these for are to address postmodernism. Like I said earlier, if you know pretty much anybody in my generation, you will know somebody that subscribes to postmodernism and would likely say something in the same vein of, if you're making hard Christian claims, they'll say, well, that could be true for you, but that's not true for me. That statement could be true, in your own little world and heart, but that doesn't apply to me, so it's not true for me. Do you guys know any friends or relatives or younger people, older people that do subscribe to this? Anybody that cared to share? Or has anybody had any conversations with friends, non-friends, believers, non-believers who might hold this? Yeah. Care to share how that went, or?
Yeah, a lot of conversations I had with people with that kind of attitude are very committed to playing the fence.
Okay.
I have a hard time with people that just say one thing or the other. So even admit the nature of truth.
Yeah.
They're committed to that worldview. If your truth is your truth, then it really isn't true.
I've kind of found that when I have conversations with people about this, when you break it down, they'll agree with a lot of the things you're saying, but then there's like something that doesn't connect when they go outside of that conversation and then start talking about morals and things like that. That truth, like the absolute truth of morals, doesn't connect there for some reason. If that makes sense?
Okay. But they might think that there is absolute truth, but that doesn't apply in the realm of when it comes to morals.
Right. It's like they'll agree with that, but then when you actually talk about how that affects your life, they won't agree with it.
I think that part of the problem with talking about truth is there's always assumptions. I mean, even in mathematics, I think it's very objective, but it's based on very few assumptions, but it's based on assumptions. You prove everything from those assumptions. And so when you have a worldview, you're assuming that either there's God or there's not God. And, can you get past those assumptions? I think that's what this class is. How far do you go down? Where's your basic assumption to bring up that there is God?
Can you kind of summarize that again? Sorry, I see. Was wondering if you could get a little louder. You want to reiterate that to the class? I appreciate that.
Yes. So, like I was saying, in mathematics, even you think it's very objective, but it's still based on assumptions. You have to assume a few things to be able to get to the next level. So I would guess apologetics is finding out where the base assumptions are to work up towards you want to go.
Yeah, so these laws of logic seem very abstract and ethereal and kind of out there and not practical, but they are extremely practical and are extremely important when when talking with somebody who does believe that truth is relative, because that has huge implications for their eternity. If they refuse to accept the truth of Jesus simply because they say, well, it's true for you and not true for me, this idea that truth is relative, or whether or not truth can be absolute, etc., that's not just abstract stuff. That has implications on people's lives and eternity that you can help break through to them by understanding these and kind of doing a little bit what we're doing. So, the postmodern idea, I kind of phrase it a couple different ways. One, somebody might say truth cannot be known. So regarding whether or not truth is absolute, they would just say truth is something that cannot be known. Maybe there is truth, but we can't actually know it. A lot of people who call themselves agnostics would kind of portray that idea that, maybe there is truth, maybe there is a God, but I can't know truth or I can't know that God. I think that because we're finite beings, I think that because we're so limited in our brain power, there's no point in saying, I know something. You always have to say, like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And what's the bother in having strong convictions when you have to admit that you have such a small, limited, finite brain? So, the person saying truth cannot be known is saying implicitly, I'm going to diagram this out just so that it's abundantly clear. They're saying, basically, one, truth is not knowable. That's their claim initially. But implicitly, what they are also saying, in order to say this statement, they're saying, this is a truth that I know. And in order for that statement to be true, this is a truth that I know, you must also then affirm truth is knowable. And, all right, I spelled it all out just so that it's very obvious and clear that statements 1 and 3 are a blatant formal violation of the law of non-contradiction. We're saying that something is and something is not in the same breath. Therefore, you're violating the law of non-contradiction. What you're saying does not make sense. And is it possible? This is what people would claim clearly. They may or may not claim the second one. And what I'm saying is that 2 and 3 necessarily follow from 1, even though they might not be claiming that. So if somebody is claiming that to you, then lovingly, and if it fits the occasion, if it's right, then you can hopefully walk through them, steps 2 and 3, that, well, in order for this to be true, that truth is not knowable, you're saying that that's a truth that you know, correct? Yes, or then, ask them, like, is that what you're saying? Is that a truth that you know? And if you are saying that truth is knowable, or if you are saying that that's a truth that you know, then are you also saying that truth is knowable? Hopefully, maybe they'll understand that if you do it in a loving way. Okay, same concept, except rather than addressing truth not being knowable, let's do that same statement with claiming that there is no absolute truth. So that's kind of the flip side of a lot of people who would call themselves postmodern. Well, usually people wouldn't identify that as that, but people would claim that truth is relative. They would say, absolute truth does not exist. And then the second statement, in order for this to be true, I think number 2 necessarily follows, even though the person would not outwardly say it at the same time. They would say, in order for one to be true, this is an absolute truth. Because that is exactly what somebody is doing when they claim number one. Absolute truth does not exist. That's an absolute truth that they're claiming. So that's the second one. So in order for this to be an absolute truth, you are inherently saying absolute truth does exist. So similarly to when we said truth is not knowable and truth is knowable in the same breath, you cannot say absolute truth does not exist and absolute truth does exist in the same train of thought. A lot of people might have a huge objection to the fact that, millions of people would claim statements 1 and 1 on either side of the board here, and we can't just defeat these worldviews in a 2-second simple argument. I respect that and I understand that. Yet, at the same time, I believe pretty strongly that despite how many people subscribe to a certain truth or as complicated as people try to make it, if something is very simple and has a simple error, the correction, I think, can be very simple. And kind of a third example of this is something called logical positivism. Positivism. It's kind of a philosophic standpoint. Logical positivism states that only facts that are empirically verifiable are true. But since logical positivism cannot be empirically verified, it must not be true. That just similarly can so easily be undermined just by pointing out it defeats itself. So just how the three laws of logic were self-proving, I believe pretty strongly these are self-defeating. Yeah. You guys have any questions about either of these or about postmodernism at all? Or
So what is it then it kind of evolves into, well, that's your truth. It isn't my truth.
yeah, it might be hard to avoid an endless cycle of, well, that's your truth. That truth is not noble, and truth is noble, and that this is a contradiction. Yep, that can happen.
What I've realized, or what I've noticed a lot in today's culture is people will accept, yes, there is truth, but my preference trumps truth. It's like, well, yeah, maybe you found the truth, but I don't really care. I prefer to believe this, so I'll just keep believing that. It works for you, great. Maybe it is true, but I don't really care if it's true because my preference trumps the truth. So it's where they'll give it to you. They'll be like, yeah, that looks logical. Maybe it's true, but I don't really care.
Yeah.
One thing is that, especially if the truth is not knowable, is most people will probably not claim that about science, but they'll claim that about religious claims. So they'll say religious claims about, God are not completely or more so absolute, but scientific claims like gravity is absolute. Like they won't deny universally all types of truth. They'll like I said earlier, there'll be distinctions because it would seem very, very illogical to just deny all of science by saying it's not absolute. You can't know it. Most people would confirm that it's knowable, and they would actually hinge most of their truth on it being knowable and absolute. But it's particularly for religious or moral claims, that's when it gets into the postmodern-esque absolute and knowableness.
Yep. Yeah, so James said that a lot of people put science and religion religious belief in different categories, and they say, well, there is such thing as absolute truth, and it is knowable when it comes to science, but when it comes to God and religion, there's no such thing as absolute truth, and that it's not knowable. They'll just kind of arbitrarily divide those. Which perfectly segues us into the next topic of, can truth about God... Yeah?
Can I ask before we shift into that?
Yeah.
Can we talk for maybe a few minutes about true aspects to relativism? True aspects of postmodernism?
Yeah, sure, and I would, yes, if you have something you want to say on that, please do. I think I don't want to characterize this is postmodernism. You know, postmodernism is a whole. If we talk about pre-modernism and modernism and postmodernism, there's a lot more to it than just that. I was kind of specifically just addressing the idea of a lot of people believe truth is relative, and that's flows from postmodernism. But yeah, please do.
Well, I think it's important to I mean, as true as this is, if we stop there, I think we won't get very far in a lot of conversations. Because the idea of relativism is that everything needs to be understood within its own context. And there's really true and important, I mean, that's reality in a lot of ways. You know, is a cuss word truly, absolutely a cuss word? Well, in a certain culture, those sounds offend the society, and so it's inappropriate to say those sounds in that society. But if you take the exact same sounds, the same word, into a different language, it's not a cuss word. It's nonsense. It doesn't offend anybody. So it's like, okay, well, is it truly a cuss word? Well, that's relative. It's relative to how it's used and where it's used, but not absolutely. Or if you have a ping pong ball in a boxcar in a train, and somebody hits the ping pong ball and it flies across the table at 20 miles an hour, you say, well, that ping pong ball is absolutely going 20 miles per hour. But if the train is moving at 50 miles an hour, then, well, within the boxcar, within its system, its context, yes, that ball is traveling 20 miles an hour, true. But what if you're standing outside of the train on the ground and the train zooms past and you could see the ball? You would actually say, from your perspective, that ball is going 70 miles an hour. And that's true from your perspective. So in some ways, and you could just mount tons of these things, and even getting into morals, certain morals. You know, is that always the right or wrong thing to do? So it seems to me that there may be a way that postmodernism, or at least the relative aspect, that truth needs to be understood in its system, has some truth to it. Is that wrong for a Christian to admit? Do we defeat ourselves if we say that might actually be true and right?
Proposing that, or just a hypothetical?
I'm just kind of throwing that out to anybody.
Yeah.
It's okay for a Christian to see some kind of relativism.
So, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you at all. So for the two examples that you listed, hopefully that makes sense. That makes sense to me that within the context, those things are true, but not quote absolutely true in other contexts. And so I would say that is an example of where we talked about the law of the excluded middle, that when defined a certain way, those things are true. Do I think it is absolutely true that the ping pong ball is traveling 20 miles an hour in respect to the train? Yes, I would say that is an absolute truth, because I'm fully defining all of the relative parameters that you're talking about.
So it's absolutely true relatively.
Yes. Yeah.
So your question is whether you are allowed to admit a relative truth to someone in a conversation. I think that you'd be able to acknowledge the fact that it was a relative truth, but be wary of how they use you saying, yes, that is true in this aspect, but what we are talking about is much greater than that. And in any debate, someone is going to try to get a foothold on their side. So if they can admit that, have you admit that they're right, they're going to use that to their advantage. So just be aware of that when you are acknowledging the fact that, yes, that is true in that aspect. But.
And the cool thing is, the ping pong ball is going fast on the train car, which is going fast in front of you, which is going fast as it rotates in the earth, which is going fast in the universe, but God transcends all that.
So the things that we spelled out here, can come across as trite or impatient or kind of just, or even, I guess, narrow-minded, or just kind of like, aha, in 2 seconds I've defeated your whole worldview. So in light of that, do you guys remember, so in 1 Peter 3:15, the first passage we looked at the first week, right after Peter says, to give a defense for the hope that lies in you, he says, yet do it with, and he lists 2 things. Do you guys remember what those 2 things were? There was 2 characteristics, how to do it.
Gentleness and respect.
Yeah, gentleness and respect. This, without gentleness and respect, and within those, patience and love and understanding the other person, this is exactly what that is. This is just, trite and impatient and I'm smarter than you and all of those things. So that's kind of an implied thing that we have to reiterate to ourselves over and over again throughout every single class. That every single topic we talk about, the gentleness and respect has to apply as to how we go about it. We could probably discuss about like whether or not truth is real and all sorts of philosophically type things that people do in philosophy 101 classes for the next 10 hours. But is there anything anybody wanted to add to that before we move on to the next thing?
Well, just super quick, I feel like there's, like what Jonathan added, seeing what parts that somebody might be seeing that be correctly as certain things in relative to situations, but then not stopping there, because if you just live in that cloud all your life, then I think people are in denial. We obviously still have to come back to some foundation, so if we're talking about, well, is that customer really bad and that whatever, then we get beyond that and say, maybe those 4 letters in themselves aren't bad, but why would you say it's important to be kind to one another? And then just kind of trying to get past these things, allowing the things that people are saying in the ways that they're trying to be accepting, the ways that they're trying to understand how things relate to one another, and maybe stay with them in that space for a little bit, and then after that say, well, why does this matter? And then try to get to the foundation. Sometimes if we're just foundational, then we come out with no understanding or not even listening to their arguments up here, if that makes sense. But then we just stay there with them all day and talk for hours and hours, and then it's like, well, why does this matter?
Yeah, these things are a stumbling block on somebody's way to understanding Christ, and so that can sober us in the importance of addressing these things and how we address them.
Or why can we even have these conversations thinking about these relativist things where we're able to put these into different places and try to understand people. Who gave us that? Try to go
Okay, so after addressing if truth can be known at all, which hopefully we would agree that truth can be known, a lot of people, as James mentioned, say, yes, truth exists, truth is absolute in regards to scientific truth, empirical stuff, but when it comes to God and religion, that cannot be known absolutely, that truth does not exist absolutely. And they might say, if God is by definition outside of our universe, then how can we actually know anything about him? And on the surface, that would seem to make sense. Except for if we don't address 2 things. So, can truth be about God be known? Say yes. Through 2 ways. Christians call it general revelation and special revelation. It's kind of how we categorize how we can know things about God. If a God created the universe, we can make deductions about the characteristics of that God based off of the characteristics of its creation, like the fact that God must be powerful in order to create so much stuff. And that basically comes straight from Romans 1:20. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So we can know characteristics about the God that created the universe based off of his universe. The second way we can know truth about God, so that doesn't get us very far. I mean, that gets us maybe some very basic characteristics of what God could be like, is through special revelation. If this God has chosen to reveal himself in ways that we can understand, just like we understand anything else, like science and measurements in a test tube, then we can understand and come to conclusions about him as well, if he's chosen to reveal himself that way. So that leads me into kind of a little bit of what we'll talk about in depth when we talk about the resurrection, kind of the importance of miracles in apologetics. One way that we talk about special revelation and the truth behind it is through miracles. If specific knowledge about God is claimed, and then that message is backed up in a way that only a God who created our universe can, then we can know we have the right information about God. So what is that way? I would say through that God who has instituted certain laws, therefore he's the only one that can break them. If those laws are then broken and we know that a miracle has in fact happened, then that would be what we call an act of God. And an act of God can confirm a word from God. So all throughout the Bible, prophets, Jesus himself go through this train of thought. So Jesus claimed to represent God in his message, and Jesus performed miracles, ultimately the biggest one, rising from the dead, to confirm it. And he stated that that's what that was doing. An example of that, Jesus is talking to a group of people in Mark 2. He says, "Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'?" He says, "But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." So he's using the miracle that he's performing there to validate his message that he is from God and his authority as God's messenger, and specifically the Son of Man, God himself. And in the Old Testament, we see that done very clearly a few times by Elijah and Moses. With the example of Moses, when he's at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 4, God says to Moses, he's talking about a staff, and he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, "Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. And then God says to Moses, "That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." So God specifically tells Moses, you're going to perform these miracles so that they know I appeared to you, and you are an authentic messenger from me. You're speaking the true words of God because of this act of God that you're doing, that I'm empowering you to do. So that would be one big way that I would say, yes, we can know about God, even though he is, by definition, outside of our universe, if he chooses to come into our universe in a way that we can prove. Questions on that? And we'll dive into that super deep when talking about the resurrection. Okay. So the last topic, pluralism. We'll go through that somewhat quickly. A lot of people who would say that truth is relative might similarly subscribe to pluralism. They'll say, well, even if truth isn't relative, or there is absolute truth, or even if there is a God, all religions lead to the same God, and all trails are trails up the same mountain, even though we don't realize it. We're all on different trails, but they're all leading to the same peak, and etc. Or they might use an analogy about a bunch of different blind men feeling an elephant. Have you guys heard that analogy before? Basically, there's a bunch of men who are blind. The idea is that they're kind of the different religions or the different religious leaders. And they are feeling different parts of an elephant. And one guy says the leg is a tree. Another guy says he's feeling the trunk. And he says, oh, this is a snake. And another guy is feeling the tail. And he says, no, this object that we're all around is a rope. And somebody leans up against the side of the elephant, and no, this is a brick wall. And they're all only seeing pictures of this same God. But the irony of that analogy is that the person, take a step back, the person telling the analogy is simply claiming the thing that they're saying you can't claim. They're claiming to see the big picture and know exactly what's going on. They're saying, I'm outside of this, I'm the one that's not blind, all of you guys are, which is what they're getting mad at you for claiming. So, do all religions achieve the same purpose, one, and lead to the same God? My answer to that, not surprisingly, would be no. Usually people either mean one of two things. Usually when they say that, they either mean that all religions have the same goal of moral behavior, and the actual existence of God doesn't matter. Or they're saying, number two, that they mean that there is in fact a real God, but the goal of getting to him, or paradise, etc., is achieved through the same means of moral behavior. So people kind of come at it from either of those ways when they say that. So a big disclaimer when I'm gonna analyze quickly kind of the fact that the moral behavior is not the same between all religions, the end goal is not the same between all religions, and the means of obtaining that end goal is not the same between all religions. My disclaimer is that I'm going to quickly kind of describe what different religions are teaching through their books or leaders, not make claims that every single person in a certain religion is immoral and less moral than other people, but rather on the contrary, because I'm a Christian and I believe that God has put his law in our hearts and we all have a conscience, that is why we can see all people all over the world, even people who have not heard the truth about Jesus Christ, act very morally because God's law is written on their hearts. So, just want to make that disclaimer quick. So, first, addressing the issue of moral behavior. Do all religions even define that moral behavior as the same, if supposedly that is just the end goal of all religions, is to act morally? I'll kind of analyze in each of these categories a couple different groups of Christianity, Islam, and then I'll kind of lump Hinduism and Buddhism together in Eastern religion thought. So when it comes to moral behavior, I'll take an example issue of violence. How do these different religions handle violence? Eastern religions, since Buddhism is pantheistic, it regards all animals as equally valuable to humans. Some groups within Buddhism are vegetarian because of this, but the commitment to valuing all life equally varies greatly. So even causing violence to a cockroach might be seen as morally bad. In Hinduism, cows are considered sacred, and in many parts of India it is illegal to kill them. An example of this that I found recently, in May of 2018, that's less than a year ago, a mob killed a man for killing a cow. That's coming from a different moral ethic of what they think is right, based off of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, for example. Or in the Indian state of Gujarat, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but in 2017, that's just a little over a year ago, they legally made killing a cow punishable with life in prison. So that's flowing out of that belief. That's very different from Christianity, for example, which says that violence in any form is pretty much prohibited except for self-defense. Different people within Christianity might define it a little differently. If you're a Mennonite, you might have a different view on self-defense, for example. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well." So Christianity makes a huge distinction between people and animals, however, so totally different than the Buddhist and Hindu idea. They make a huge distinction and say that we can take and eat animals freely. And I get that from Acts chapter 10 with Peter's pigs in a blanket experience. You guys remember that? When God says, shows them all the animals and says, eat them. So another contrast to that would be Islam, where I'm getting this from the Quran, that violence and murder are justified and seen as morally commendable when done to spread Islam, or if Muhammad has been slandered. And I can take that from a number of verses. One specific one I could cite is Surah 9:29, fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who are given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya willingly while they are humbled. And that weird word in there refers to a tax that would have been imposed to non-Muslims living in their territory. So if I'm understanding that verse and hundreds of others in the Quran correctly, that completely contradicts the Christian idea of moral behavior when it comes to violence, or the Buddhist or Hindu idea of morality when it comes to violence. So that's just kind of an example of, if all religions are achieving the same purpose of moral behavior, they're not achieving the same moral behavior, so they're not achieving the same purpose. Second one is that the end goal is not the same between all religions. In Christianity, heaven will consist of communion with God, but, for an example, absence of marriage relationships, and as far as we can tell, it is implied that there will be no sex in heaven either. So that when Jesus talks about not giving in marriage in heaven. But in Islam, sexual gratification seems to be central to the descriptions of heaven in the Quran, although the descriptions in other ways may have many similarities. So, for example, chapter 78, verses 30 to 32 in the Quran, indeed, for the righteous is attainment, gardens and grapevines and full-breasted companions. It's kind of like that I'm citing that. But that's an example of that in the Quran, each description of heaven usually provides very in-depth detail of sexual gratification or fulfilling your lusts, when that's totally opposite of the Christian view, or even more potentially opposite than the Eastern religion view, where in Buddhism, your whole goal is to suppress all desires, and ultimately, when you get to nirvana, you've suppressed all desires, and you're one with the great nothingness, and all desires have been eliminated. Whereas in Islam, it's just satisfying all those desires for eternity. It's totally different. So their end goal is not even necessarily the same. And kind of the last one, with that, the means of obtaining that end goal would not be the same between our religions as well. I guess the simple thing I would point out is that every religion, except for Christianity, makes the means of obtaining our end goal that moral behavior that we're talking about. But the distinction between Christianity and every single other religion is that we're not obtaining that goal for ourselves through moral behavior, but that end goal has been obtained for us. And that's a massive distinction that we can stress. And so, as long as we understand those laws of logic and that things cannot contradict to one another, we can hopefully apply those to talking about pluralism and point out that because religions contradict each other in the truth that they claim, they cannot both be true. And similarly to how the postmodern ideas of truth being not knowable or absolute truth not existing, being self-defeating, I would say that pluralism is also self-defeating in its claim, the fact that pluralism is still exclusivistic in its claim that anything opposed to pluralism is false, even though it tries to affirm other logical contradictions among differing religions. So it says contradictions are okay, except you're not allowed to contradict the idea that contradictions are okay, because then that doesn't jive with what I'm saying. It's like those are two statements, similarly to here, that make pluralism not tenable. It doesn't make sense if you claim both of those things at the same time. Contradictions are okay, except you can't contradict me and say no, because that would be a contradiction. Kind of a humorous story that I like from a guy named Ravi Zacharias, who I quoted a few times last week. When he's talking about postmodernism and pluralism, he tells a story of when he was giving a seminar one time. And so Ravi Zacharias is from India. He's well acquainted with Hinduism and Eastern religions. And he's in America giving a lecture. And an American professor opposes him and says that everything that he's saying might be well and true for him, but he's applying the Western both-and logic to Eastern religions, which are, he's applying the either or Western logic to Eastern religions where they do the both and logic. So basically he's trying to tell Ravi Zacharias that you're claiming absolute truth and that there can't be contradictions, but that's a Western idea. In Eastern religions, they're relativistic and they use the both and logic, that contradictions can both happen. And so Ravi Zacharias hears him out and basically at the end says, are you saying that in India, which is where he's from, I must use either the both and logic or nothing else? And then the professor says just the either or logic does seem to emerge, doesn't it? It's just kind of a funny, him pointing out that the professor's point that he was trying to make defeats itself, kind of like the self-defeating things we were trying to spell out earlier. And then after that he said, in India we still look both ways before we cross the street, because it's either me or the bus, not both of us. I like that. So hopefully we got a good idea of the implications of truth and how we can clearly and articulately explain what truth is based off of those laws of logic that we went through. Hopefully that wasn't too dry and boring. But the rubber really meets the road when we're talking about these things, which are huge stumbling blocks for people, specifically a lot of people in my generation. They will subscribe to these things whether or not they might articulate them quite like how I have. So I think it can be very helpful for us to be able to very formally go through these things so that we can, if the timing is right and we're loving, gentle, and respectful, we can go through them. Yeah, Charlie, you have to say.
I don't really have a profound thought, but maybe the complication in these discussions, you're acting like everything is a primary distinction and it's obvious and it's black and white. Whereas every other class we have here, we're debating secondary things that were blue in the face. This is confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So the world they're confronted with, we're also confronted with. We're just separating truths in different buckets, and we're saying these are absolute. But man, are we wrestling with what's right in almost every same situation that you would. We're just sorting these out first. So I don't know how you do that, but I think if you can wrestle with them and say, yes! And there are some truths that aren't really in the hand. Deciding where the line is, I think, is hard. But just the understanding that the bulk of what they're wrestling with, we're wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's from a different vantage point. There's a few things we're not wrestling with, or that we can discern. So anyway, that's helpful.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. If we are not humbly admitting that even though it may come across as though everything in my mind is figured out and I know what is true and is not true, and I use little arguments like this to point things out, that I think everything is black and white. All Christians agree, we never argue, like that's not true. that we can be humble and admit that we don't know certain things, that even some of the things I might tell to a non-believer, I have to admit, well, even though I think this is true, this is actually kind of a subtopic that Christians even kind of debate about. For instance, when talking to a friend of mine about predestination and election, like, even though I believe a certain thing about that, and I'm trying to explain that to you because you're wondering about the Christian worldview, Christians actually don't agree necessarily on this, and we debate this amongst ourselves as well. And if we don't humbly admit those things, then we just come across as cold and harsh and academic. So. Yeah. Well, does anybody have any closing thoughts or questions?
I think in light of that, it's helpful to, I found it to be helpful to make a distinction, like if you're talking about morality, of like an absolute morality and an objective morality, and like making that differentiation of like Christianity claims an objective morality, which then takes into context and everything in that. And like I think that's helpful of like saying, yes, we do see the nuance. We do understand that there's things that need to be taken into consideration with all morality. Because Christianity says that murder is wrong, but yet there's times where murder is justifiable. So what is that? Is that an absolute? Yeah, exactly. So is that like an absolute morality, or is that an objective morality? So I found in conversations with friends helpful to make that distinction, because a lot of people have found think that like Christians are truly black and white in all contexts, no matter what. It's like, well, no, So I found it to be helpful along those lines of saying, hey, yeah, there are things, and there's things we don't know, there's things we wrestle with, and figure out. Everything needs careful consideration.
Different way, which I think you guys have said, is when people say relative, 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 they're actually saying relative to me, right? So we can talk about worldviews, but they really just want you to get to know them and their view and what are they going through, and the more focused you get down, it's not about theories of world religions, it's what was their last year like, and why is that, why are they coming, what is their specific context, why they're wrestling through it. It kind of unravels the worldview discussion that they may have because they're generally thinking about, but in reality, their worldview is them. And are you gonna, is your truth relative to me, or am I just like out hanging out to dry here?
Okay. So next week we're going to talk about, now that this is kind of the end of our foundations for apologetics, kind of tackling the hurdles of can we actually know truth before we even talk about what truth is. We're going to transition then into kind of what we think those truths are, starting with some of the arguments for the existence of God. The first one being the cosmological argument. And I would say that the cosmological argument, personally, is my favorite of all the arguments for God, and is kind of general revelation or natural theology, which we talked about earlier, at its finest, where I think when we look at the beginning of the universe, we can draw implications from it and from things that are relatively not controversial in modern-day science. And it has huge implications that are mind-blowing with how they line up with Scripture. And it's so encouraging to me, and can also be an excellent example of how Christian truth lines up with reality, or what is, or the facts. So, does anybody want to close this in prayer? Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, thanks, John.
Father, Son, and Spirit, one God, we are eternally indebted to you for opening our dull, dark, and blind eyes to see and know you in a true way. Certainly not a full way. We could never exhaust the knowledge of who you are. But you've given us a true knowledge of you, and we're indebted to you for that. And we also are grateful that you work in other people. So as we have conversations like some of these with friends, and I do ask that you would give us boldness to do that, would you go before us and prepare the way, cause our friends to wrestle with certain things that we may be able to see fruit in our conversations? Or would you give us the humility to plant seeds and not see fruit, and not ever know if that will grow into anything fruitful? You know, you have it planned, and you are gracious. And we thank you for bringing us into your mission to save people and give sight to those who are blind. Please give us humility as we leave from here, and make that sink in deeply so that it becomes the fabric of who we are when we engage others. Thank you for Ricky, for the wisdom and knowledge that you've given him. And now would you open our hearts and minds to praise you like we haven't before, upstairs with each other. In Jesus' name.